I'm here today with Rebecca Burgess, and I'm so grateful that she's here and that she took the time to sit here and talk with us today. Rebecca, can you introduce yourself and let us know what organization you work for?
My name is Rebecca Burgess, and I'm the executive director of an organization, a nonprofit educational organization called Fibershed.
Can you tell us what you do there, what Fibershed does?
Fibershed works on the development of regional and regenerating systems of textile and fiber production. So I say the regenerating part because there's a lot of work to do to restore working landscapes. So we work heavily on the restoration of working landscapes as a source for our fiber and dye, and then the milling systems that accompany those regenerative materials, or regenerating materials, I would say, are another part of our focal point, is to make sure we're rebuilding infrastructure.
Cool. I first met Rebecca when I was at California School of Herbal Studies in 2010 or 2011, and she was the person that first introduced me to botanical dyes, and I think that's when your book had come out too in 2011, Harvesting Color. So can you tell us about Harvesting Color and how that came about?
Yes, I started natural dyeing as a response to working with synthetic dyes, and I was working with synthetic dyes from age 18, 19, maybe up until 20, where I was being asked to teach young children simple things like dyeing your t-shirt as part of your summer camp experience, and recognized that there was a lot of potentially hazardous things about what I was doing and what I was teaching children to do. So I didn't want to perpetuate something that I didn't feel comfortable with. So I looked into what alternatives there were, and those were dyeing with blackberries, dyeing with beets, dyeing with cabbage. And I just started to look more deeply into this idea that plants actually do bring forth color, and the dyeing process, the dyer can bring that color forth with the way that they metabolize through heat or water and immersion of the material. You can do all these very simple things to move and transfer pigment from a plant onto a textile. And that got me very interested in, like, what are these dye recipes, and where do these plants grow? How many of them grow in my community, and do any of them grow in my community? So I just started to do more digging. I brought very simple recipes back to the children that were mainly food-based dyes, but then it sent me on a trajectory of working to understand really how to make dye, what's the chemistry inside a plant that can provide particular dye color, and then just looking, my primary interest is intact ecosystems, so like looking at how to, ecosystems are always changing, and they're always doing one thing or the other. They're either growing and gaining in diversity and complexity, or they're degenerating into less complexity. So I'm interested in how to enhance complexity in an ecosystem and enhance interactions between soil and plants, insects, mammals, bird life. And so how do dye plants fit into intact ecosystem development? And I've just been conscious and seen and lived in a lot of degraded landscapes where humans have disrupted the balance and things are off kilter, and thus they need to be brought back into balance, but yet they'll never really return to the way they were prior. So I don't use the term restoration very much in that sense, because we can't really do something that would return something back to the way it was. But we can enhance complexity. And so I'm interested in the plants are native to my area and bringing them back into places where maybe they were, but the right aspect, the right soil type. This is where Artemisia could be. This is where coyote brush could be. This is where heteromeles arbutifolium could be. So I've gotten very interested in that intersection between, I guess you could call it restoration ecology, but it's more like complexity and dye systems. And how can you do well by the land and have the land eliciting these materials by just being in respect of that landscape and trying to work with it instead of degrading it.
Yeah. And then how did you make the transition from natural dyes and then starting Fibershed? Like where, because I mean, obviously that's part of the whole system, but where was the inspiration, or what point did you get to where you're like, wow, I really need to start this organization if I'm going to accomplish, the regenerating these systems?
Yeah, regenerate. The verb.
Yeah.
I was observing my own clothing habits and about to publish a book that I felt a lot of responsibility with getting words out into the world, words and pictures and messages in a way that I hadn't had an opportunity to before or prior. So it's like, oh, I'm putting a book out about natural dyes. Am I wearing natural dyes? I look it down. Not so much. So the idea was then, how could I look at my own wardrobe and become a better representative of the work that I have so valued? How do I be more integrative in my own life between the messaging I'm interested in promoting and my own personal practice? It seems really simple, but in the textile system, I think for food people, you often get a really great chef writing a cookbook. But in the world of textiles and craft and hobby, I would say there can be a chasm, like between us treating textiles in our country more like a hobby, like something like knitting might be more considered craft, whereas cooking, it's like you do 3 times a day. It's a very robust and integral thing. But natural dyes, I mean, even the publisher of the book was like, this is part of our craft section. So it didn't have this worldliness about it, really. It was more like, how does this fit in with something a woman could do on the weekend when she has extra time with her toddlers or something? And, there's a little bit of that, like cloaking what you do in this tiny sphere of where you think the American public will be interested. But I wasn't super keen on thinking about it in my work in that limited way. I was thinking, well, clothing is our second skin. Clothing, we would not survive in even Northern California without clothing for 24 hours, 9 months of the year. We'd be dead before we were even dehydrated. If we went without water, food, and clothing, you'd be dead without clothing first. So it's kind of important. So then I just kind of repositioned my own thinking, I should say, and then retooled. And the retooling process was, what do I want to wear? What is responsible? How do I integrate natural dyes better into my own life as part of an integral part of my life, not just a practice I do outside, stirring pots and gardening and, making nice little small accessories, but how do I wear this from head to toe? And so, yeah. And then there's the whole idea of our country being primarily a war economy and seeking oil all over the world for everything. Oil for dyes, oil for plastic, oil for the fuel for your car. And so this whole idea of divesting from fossil carbon is really important. It's just important for everybody
It's
right
really revolutionary of you.
At the time, 2009, I mean, people have been talking about it for a while, but I think just weaving it together with ecology and the idea of conservation work, like protecting landscapes, enhancing landscapes, but then how do we put the human back in the landscape in a responsible way? As we know, it can be done, and many cultures have perfected over millennia. How do you bring the human back into nature and then divest from fossil carbon and wear your values? And all these things are starting to play out in my sphere and thinking and acting. And so then the Fibershed model is really a synthesis of all of these values and ideas. And what it is just try to work within the home landscape that you know well. You know the plants, the rainfall pattern, the soil types, the community, the skills, the cultural heritage. Why don't you try to work in your community and develop a prototype wardrobe that reflects the landscape and right relationship with landscape and right relationship with people?
So I'm in the process right now I've been doing the company that I have for almost 5 years. And it's really hard for me because a lot of the stuff in my closet is still stuff that I had prior to being awake, but I didn't throw it out, and it's still stuff that I wear. So how did you make start making the transition from what your closet was like then to what it is now? Because right now you're sitting here, and I know that I'm pretty sure everything you're wearing is wool, wool made locally or. Yeah, which I'm aspiring to have in my, like, so now what I do is if I buy something, like now, like I started this a few years ago, now if I buy something that it is a natural fiber, it is something that I usually know exactly where it comes from or who made it and what materials it's from and where it was produced. But I still have a little bit of guilt because I wear it, like right now I'm wearing a sweatshirt that's, it's cotton, but it's dyed with aniline dyes for sure. But I've had it for a while and it's really comfortable and I'm freezing because I'm from Hawaii. So I'm just curious, like, how that transition was for you and what you did. Like, was it you just you donated everything and then started from scratch, or like what was that process like for you? Because I think that's a question that a lot of people have too, is how did they start, getting more in alignment with what you're talking about, and then also just trying to make the transition to sustainable fashion, even if could be cost prohibitive, or they maybe not be able to find stuff in their own regions that were made in those areas.
Well, I think my project was a bit of an art piece in some ways, in the way that I really did just clear out a closet of clothing and left myself with no underwear, no socks, nothing industrially produced,
Wow.
and donated to my brother's girlfriend, neighbors, people who, I've always really liked well-made natural fiber clothing. It wasn't that the clothing I had it just wasn't of my landscape. It didn't have me exercising the muscle of creativity in the way that this new venture was going to help me explore. So I did clear everything out. Do I recommend other people do that? I don't know. It's up to you. But one of the ways that I think is, perhaps more approachable, I should say, is when one is seeking to acquire a new thing. I think keeping your clothes in play, the existing things in your wardrobe in play as long as physically possible is clearly the most ethical thing to do from a climate change and a social justice perspective. Just, keep what you got for as long as it will exist. And when it doesn't work anymore, can it be mended? Can it be hemmed, changed? Ideally. But then when you look to acquire something new, I think that the questions that I ask, that others then ask, hopefully people are asking, is this 100% natural fiber? Because right now, less than 1% of the world's textiles are recycled. And a lot of that is that it's become it is price prohibitive at current to take a t-shirt like that has X amount of polyester and X amount of cotton, which is a very common fast fashion. It's how we've created fast fashion. We've injected polyester into all this cotton and made all these crazy amounts of cheap clothes because we subsidize fossil fuel through war economies, and we make it cheap. And so it's a socially unjust fiber. I would argue polyester I think it has no place in the textile system, even as a recycled fiber, I would argue, and other people disagree. I think get rid of it. If it is under any kind of abrasion, it's producing plastic lint. But anywho, back to 1% of our textiles are recycled. That is something that needs to be looked at, because where they're not being recycled, they're potentially going into the rag trade. They're potentially being downgraded in value into maybe being shredded, maybe becoming insulation in a car, maybe being insulation in some furniture or stuffing. But overall, if you buy a textile that have something that, even if we don't have yet the robust recycling systems that would keep something like a nice virgin material at least operable for 3 to 5 generations, you at least have in a 100% natural fiber purchase the ability for that textile, A, to be washed repeatedly and not create microplastic pollution during the use phase while you own it. 2, if it's 100% natural fiber textile, it can, probably after you've washed it a lot, all those typical agents that people are putting, the wrinkle-free, the stain-resistant stuff. There are synthetic chemistry details here that we aren't talking about, but they're real. And then the synthetic dyes that go on natural fibers are very problematic. Overall, though, a natural fiber garment has a better chance of going back to the soil. and being eaten by microbes and becoming carbon for the recycling of life that this planet has been doing through decomposition pathways for billions of years. Mm. So I have a sense that your purchasing power for new clothes is very meaningful, and people should take that seriously while treating their existing clothes with as much integrity as possible.
Yeah. No, that makes me feel better. Thank you.
Sure.
Because sometimes I feel like a hypocrite. Like if I go and I'm talking about, natural fibers and natural dyes and how it's affecting our health, and then I'm wearing something that's not, but it's, something I've had for a long time, and I just keep it in play. Yeah. But then I think about the washing, and I think that was a big aha for me. Or I shouldn't say aha, but just a big piece of information when you're actually, even though, if you just washing something and all the microplastics and the things that go into the water system from that everyday practice that people do however many times a week, it's kind of crazy.
I mean, the kind of textile lines, I don't know, I don't want to call out names in a way that feels indicting, but there are people who are, into ocean activism that are using ocean plastics to then reclaim that plastic and then make clothes that then people wash, and then they make plastic lint out of the thing they were trying to keep out of the ocean in the first place.
Yep.
And I'm just kind of like, stop that, please.
I have a really hard time with that. I started I commented on one of these companies that was doing it, and I brought that up, and they got very defensive about it.
They're very passionate.
They're very passionate.
They don't want to hear about it. And there's people who say, we can spin it in a way that, I've seen innovators bring me textiles that say this is recycled plastic and it's gotten through all the abrasion tests and it doesn't abrade. And so then I go, okay, fine. During the use cycle, you might have eliminated most of the lint, perhaps. There's less than 0.00% of whatever people actually with access to these non-abrading textiles. This is a very innovative thing. I don't think it's marketed fully yet.
Yeah.
But let's say you can even get that out there. Then my next question to this innovator was, well, on the back end of the functional use phase, where someone's wearing this thing that you're telling me doesn't abrade plastic back into the marine ecosystem, okay, I'll trust you that far, even though I have some serious questions about your testing methodology. Then we get to the point where the person's done with it. Then where does it go? Because we are still dealing with less than 1% of the textiles being recyclable, and the more you blend, the more complex the separate. You have to, if you're going to recycle something, you do have to kind of, think about separation. And they're like, oh no, we just would respin it all, whatever, shred it and then respin it. And I haven't seen evidence of that being done well. Yeah. So I just think until we have a more robust, in every community, set of recycling systems and the abrasion tests are really proven out to be for real, plastic we can recycle plastic and put it into non-abrading goods. I've seen people building roadways with recycled plastic. Yep. I've seen sidewalks.
They're doing that in Canada, with the government, on a really big scale, I believe. I heard that from someone.
And those roadways are supposedly a lot more durable, even.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I just think I call it the question of highest and best use. Yeah. And that's such a fundamental question for circular economy focused people. It's okay, circularity, but circularity with a lot of Socratic method questioning, and what's scalable, and not scalable I'm not talking scale monolithic centralized facilities. I mean, what's replicable in communities? What can all communities afford to do to recycle a textile, or to make sure a textile doesn't end up in landfill, or make sure a textile doesn't end up incinerated? If these clothing manufacturers can give us a textile that they have everything worked out on the back end, and they want to fund all that, then I would entertain some possibilities. But to just say, well, technically speaking, we're designing a textile that we know could be recycled. Thanks, but just for now, natural fiber, it'll end up in the compost pile at best. If it ends up in the landfill, that's problematic, but it's better than having more plastics in our landfill.
And so from my standpoint too, I think about wearing that against your skin, and also when you're, the plastic against your skin, and how, we're supposed to be breathing through our skin, and plastic kind of prevents that from happening through, just the way that it's suffocating our dermis, I guess. And I don't know, that's always just something intuitively that I felt. I don't think there are any like studies that show that, but what are your feelings about like the health implications of wearing plastics or any synthetic material against the skin like that? I mean, I think I did an interview with you at one point, and you just talk about how it's getting absorbed directly through your dermis into the bloodstream, and that there's no liver that's, filtering out whatever the chemicals are that we're absorbing through the skin. And I wonder with plastic, like what's happening there. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share? Or
well, there hasn't been enough, peer-reviewed or even basic science for us to know wholeheartedly what's happening with the dermis layer related to plastic clothing. And I talked to some physicians about this, and they said, well, it's really hard to fund that research.
Well, yeah.
And I said, I wonder why.
Yeah.
So I see that the reality that we, as a society, aren't even willing to ante up and fund research to test what could be happening on the biggest organ of our body with the daily usage of wearing clothes that have aniline dyes and plastic fibers. To me, it's the same kind of thought pattern that I ask those who are designing, the non-abrading polyester clothing. Like, if you haven't designed really a holistic model for handling that, it shouldn't be put in use in this sector. And I have the same approach with the plastic clothing. We know that if you burn this stuff, it creates dioxin poisoning. We know that plastics are estrogenic and they create hormone disruption in the human system in different forms, different leaching processes, under different conditions. So my question is, if the body's producing heat and water, in the form of sweat, and we're wearing plastic, are we not volatilizing any of that?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for, the dermis layer? What does it mean for inhalation, for the nose and the mouth, breathing materials that are heating up on our own bodies? I just think if no one's willing to do the research, I have that kind of, well, then don't put it out there.
Yeah.
If you want to do the research about it and prove to us all that this is not carcinogenic or autoimmune disease producing or neurotoxic, the burden should be on the people producing this to tell us that it's not. Yeah. And if they can't, then I don't think they have any business putting it into commercial status.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you. So on a more positive note, what is something that you're seeing that is inspiring in this space? And we'll cut this part, but just continue answering.
The thing that's inspiring is the grassroots organizing efforts that I see in communities across the country and world that are saying, we actually want to know what our region is capable of. What could we be farming that could produce the new natural fiber and dye recipe? What kind of milling systems might we have had in the past, and could we rebuild them? Or did we not have certain milling systems that would be beneficial to us now that we could build? How do we connect the act of producing to the act of consuming? And I highlight that. There's been a paper about that called prosumption that I really like, the act of being a consumer and a producer. And these grassroots communities give you a lot of opportunity to go harvest indigo and help make the vat and then dye your own clothes as a community. We've seen that start to happen where we have it in our community. We have a community indigo vat now in Sonoma County. We have a little community group in the Rust Belt Fibershed doing they've done a flax community garden project. They've done an indigo community garden project. And so, these 50 national and international communities, to me, are the balm, the healing balm on, and the response to saying brands have become hollow shells that basically market things that they don't really make. Yeah. And so we're actually being told what's fashionable and what's cool by a lot of white North American or European white-collar jobs that basically just pump out materials that are coming from Mexico, South America. We don't actually Southeast Asia. It's very rare that we see major brands actually like owning a mill, owning the mills that they work with, having the people who work in the cut and sew be actually part of their team.
Yeah.
You know, the brand is an isolated, generally marketing structure that just pumps out stuff. And sure, they do some design work and they coordinate with their suppliers and they have logistics jobs, but they're not really the makers. And so what I have found really interesting in these grassroots community responses is that people are saying, wait a minute, how are our clothes made? And I should know how to do this because A, it's part of my survival and my basic human right to know how my clothes are made. But also, if we're going to create something ethical, shouldn't we all be involved in understanding the implications for how clothing is made and how else to learn what those implications are, but to do it yourself and to really discover that so that when you are making a clothing choice, you can go, yeah, I have used indigo, natural indigo, and yeah, there is a lot of water usage involved in natural indigo. So I'm going to look for people who are using rain catchment and recycled water. If you give yourself your own embodied experiences as a grassroots maker, it does help you make even better decisions in the marketplace. Let alone you could also just start as a community producing enough textile to clothe your community, which in our community, we still aren't utilizing all the fiber and dye we have available.
Wow.
Like, everyone's like, oh, there's 7 million people in the Bay Area. And I'm like, yeah, and there's 250 million pounds of cotton being grown in California and 3 million pounds of wool, and we don't have markets for all of it.
Wow. I didn't realize that. That's amazing.
So we're not even clothing everybody. We have way more material than we have actually that material getting on the backs of the populace. So I find the whole thing kind of ironic that there's like, oh, there's this scarcity, natural fibers can't clothe people. I'm like, can't clothe the whole world, And I'm like, well, okay, can we at least try? Because at least we would help some of these farmers out that aren't even selling everything that they grow.
Wow. And is that just because brands aren't sourcing their materials from these places, or is it there aren't mills here to process that fiber, or is it all of the above?
It's both of those things, for sure. The brands are making convenient decisions with industry players who have become more trusted allies, which are generally in Asia, because when you move that much of an infrastructure body out of Western countries and you move it to Asia, it's not like a snap of the fingers to move production around. These supply chains they're capitally intensive, they're very low margin businesses, and they need a lot of skill. So once you offshore your skill and you offshore these high capitally intensive structures, they're there. So our farmers aren't now in proximity to those supply chains, right? So they're feeding into these global commodity markets, and the wool and the cotton get moved around to where the supply chains are, which are generally Asian supply chains at the moment. So if we put milling back closer to the farms and ranches, brands would have an easier time of sourcing from a more regional hub. That would be great.
So I think that answers the other question I had, which was, what's something in the industry or field that you think could use improvement? So it's kind of just what you had just said, but is there something else that you wanted to add to that, or something that's really like burning in terms of what you feel really needs to shift, like immediately, for the needle really to be moved in a significant way?
I think everyone just doing their own evaluation on their own wardrobe and really looking at and asking questions about where it came from, biologically speaking, not only the human hands, and just giving yourself time to ponder, how did this get to me? And what could be the climate change implications for that, and what could be the justice implications for that. Would I, who's wearing this thing, wanted to have worked in the supply chain to bring it to me? Is that a job I would want to have done? If not, then we have some questions to ask ourselves about equity. What's fair? And so, I think those are the main things to start with, is kind of looking at one's own relationship with clothing and then from there let decisions start to change from that point forward.
Okay, so my last question for you, Rebecca, is in your day-to-day life, how do you incorporate plants? And I'm sure it's in probably all ways, but how do you incorporate plants into your life?
Well, they are my part of my morning ceremony and drinks. I make teas out of plants in my garden. I have a small tube restoring a lot of the native perennial grasses. I'm really interested in this landscape, what it might have looked like 500 years ago before the sheep and the cows and the Spaniards came, and what the Coast Miwok and the Pomo were really, for our region, what they were really maintaining, which from all accounts was like this year-round green hillside of grass that had a mosaic patchwork of different wildflower populations that were harvested for their bulbs, corms, and tubers. And a lot of wildflower seed beating that went on to produce kind of these energy ball foodstuffs that were able to store well. And I heard like only about 20% of the diet was actually harvested from freshwater shrimp or elk or pronghorn antelope. So for me, I'm looking at my landscape and I'm thinking, what's my relationship with kind of what I'm assuming what might have been here that was sequestering carbon and holding water and creating pollinator forage and also could nourish me, human. And I'm looking at that intersection. I love throwing in Western plants that, that just have almost no maybe other usage other than pure beauty. Like I mix and match, but I'm very committed to the indigenous plants that have been here much longer than and I'm very committed to beauty, and I'm very committed to ingesting plants in terms of tea, just spicing up my food. And then I grow a lot of vegetables every year and dye plants too, but I'm not enough acreage to do it all. So I don't even know how to articulate it. It's just like plants are the solace. Like yeah. I'm more comfortable with plants than pretty much anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are every time I'm around mugwort, I just feel better. Yeah, I'm like, oh, life's okay.
I was so excited. I went hiking in the Sonoma Mountains a couple days ago, and I forgot. It was at a place we used to go, my dog and I used to go hiking. And there's this really magical mugwort patch by the creek. I had forgotten about it, and he went to go to the bathroom and looking, and I was like, and it was this, this moment of, I don't know what it is about mugwort. I mean, there's so much about mugwort, but just, as a woman and the connection with mugwort that way, and then the dream ally stuff. And
I love artemisias.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's something there.
Yeah. It's a good ally for you, and apparently for me too. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. And I always learn so much talking to you, and I'm always so inspired by all the things that you're doing and all the ways that you are being and living authentically in your mission, and you're dreaming your reality all the time. So I really thank you so much. Rebecca, if people want to find more information about Fibershed, or I know that your book is on Amazon. I know that Fibershed has a website, but can you give us that information and where to find more about you and how to contact you?
Sure. So it's fibershed.com, www.fibershed.com. And we also have an agricultural co-op, which is the NorCal Fibershed Co-op. And I think you can just Google or search NorCal Fibershed Co-op. And there's a new marketplace where the farmers, natural dyers, and artisans are selling direct from their studios and farms and ranches.
Cool.
So those are two places to go. And and the book is still available through independent bookstores too.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry.
No.
Don't feel Jeff Bezos' fortune.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much.